With the establishment now of a large European-driven system in the New World that's going to be exploiting large chunks of territory for the creation of things like sugarcane and tobacco and other products that can be grown in the tropics but are in great demand in Europe. The central issue introduced right before this was with Pizarro and with Cortez and others. The Spanish and later on Portuguese as well will come into places in the New World, tackle the top leadership of the indigenous peoples, and then assume control over the labor of the indigenous peoples. When that starts to run out, within about 100 years of Columbus's arrival, the number of Native American workers is declining. The sheer population die off due to smallpox and other things. That's going to open up the idea that the Europeans have two choices. Either they can find more poor Europeans and export them to work in the New World, or they're going to have to find another labor source because the indigenous people are drying up. In that case, increasingly, they're going to start to go back into the African slave trade, which had already pre-existed, remember. It existed long before Columbus had set sail. It had existed since Roman times, if not earlier. Now they're going to be able to go back into that same system and use people from Africa as the next laborers on the plantations in the New World, in the sugarcane, tobacco, and other regions or other commodities are being grown. This map shows you a quick look at the total export in many time frames of slaves from Africa. You'll see that they're being moved around Africa. Some are being taken from Africa into Asia, but the vast majority are being exported from Africa to the colonies of the New World. Now remember, the way in which Europeans think of slavery is that at this point in time, it's usually an economic condition. Europeans had enslaved other Europeans before. Remember the Romans and the Greeks and the Egyptians, all of them had slavery. But it wasn't racialized yet. Slavery had not been racialized yet in the codified way that it will be now. With the die-off of significant numbers of indigenous people, the inability to attract lower level or poor Europeans to come and work in the conditions of the New World, that's going to set the stage for massive importation of African slaves. Participation will be in part by the African slave princes themselves, who will be supplying the prisoners of war and people they've kidnapped, bringing them down to the shore, and the Europeans are buying them and taking them to the New World. It will be an extremely brutal system. But remember, one of the things that the Europeans had sort of thought about and done before, and if you go back to, say, some of the first islands, for example, that Henry the Navigator for Portugal or the Castilians had found, they had started the process of colonizing and using territories like the Canary Islands, for example, and later on the Azores and the Madeiras. They had been using them as little mini colonies, and in each case had enforced a labor code and increasingly had put together this idea that by the virtue of being elite, European and Christian, they could use that as a way to justify what is now increasingly going to be a racialization of slavery. You'll see, for example, in early Renaissance art, the famous paintings of various important families in Italy, and you'll see that they have slaves in the background, and many of those slaves are Lithuanians and Ukrainians and Estonians. That used to be an area of Eastern Europe where there's instability. That kind of slavery now is gone as increasingly it is being racialized in the New World. As you also take a look at this, that means that the Europeans are going to have to think about how they want to do this. What are the commodities that are most valuable? And in this context, remember, there's lots and lots of land in the New World, but if you have no labor on it, it doesn't have much value. The Europeans are not inclined to bring in lots of outside European poor people to work in very rugged conditions, and the idea that they can find a better place to go is obvious. These large tropical plantations are going to need massive labor, and when the indigenous people die off, they will increasingly use African slaves. And it's also going to create what we're going to call triangular trade. And that will be a very extensive network of trade of people leaving Europe with commodities to send to Africa to exchange for slaves, to take the slaves to the New World, to exchange for all kinds of tropical products that then can be brought back to Europe. That is going to create a very powerful and very lucrative trade network called triangular trade, or the Atlantic System. It's based on massive slavery from Africa, massive production of tropical products in the New World, and then selling those back to emerging markets in Europe. Take a look in your reading and see how kind of information you can use to support this basic system, and then do, of course, see if there's any sample questions.